Hello everyone, and welcome to Grantek's first webinar of 2020, where we'll be discussing data integrity best practices. The role of data in our manufacturing businesses has changed drastically over the years as the availability of data has grown exponentially. That data has been extremely valuable, helping us to optimize production processes, customize orders, ensure product quality, and reduce energy usage. But as we make more data-driven decisions in our jobs, from confirming a CIP circuit was run sufficiently to releasing a batch for distribution, the validity of our data and the information it contains becomes more important every day. And that's where data integrity comes in. How do we make sure the data we use to make our decisions is accurate and truly representative of what it is we're assessing? So today's big ideas are really found just in the title of our webinar. We're talking about data integrity, best practices for smart manufacturing, across life sciences, and beyond. So data integrity is our primary discussion topic. After some background on that subject, we're going to discuss some best practices regarding data integrity. We'll talk about the rise of smart manufacturing and how that affects data integrity and those best practices. And from a vertical perspective, we'll certainly be talking about life sciences because this subject is such a strongly regulated focus for them. But we also want to go beyond life sciences and talk about how these principles apply to industries like food and beverage and CPG as well. By the end of this webinar, I hope to convey the following learning objectives and give you some next steps to take back to your day jobs. We're all going to be able to understand the concept of data integrity and know why it's important. We'll all be familiar with the three models that are commonly referenced to support data integrity: data governance, the data lifecycle, and Alcoa Plus. We'll discuss 5 data integrity best practices, and we'll talk about the influence of smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0 on data integrity. After this webinar, you should be armed with fresh information to review your company's policies around data integrity. And if you're finding gaps in those policies and strategies, you'll have a couple of new resources that you can reference to help you out. If all that's appealing and you're still listening, I'll ask a little bit of you to get the most out of this webinar today. First, I'll ask you do your best to eliminate distractions. I know that I'm certainly guilty of checking on emails or maybe answering a quick Skype chat during a webinar, but I also acknowledge that distracts me from the content of the webinar and can be a slippery slope to missing the important stuff. I'm not the webinar police. I can't sit in everyone's office and cubicle and make sure you're paying attention, but if you think that what we're talking about today is going to be valuable for you, please make sure that you give it the attention it deserves, and I'll do my best to keep things entertaining. If you do get distracted and need to get pulled away, that's okay. We are going to be posting this webinar to our YouTube channel, or you can always reach out to us at Grantek for more information. Next thing I'll ask is that you take some notes. Again, this is going to be posted online, so you don't need to copy down everything I say. Instead, try to focus on the ideas that you can bring back to your business. So think about actions you can take based on this content. I do truly hope that everyone in the webinar today walks away with at least one thing that they can take action on. I don't care if that's holding a meeting internally with your team or a call to me and Jeff the second this ends, or just something that you ponder on your commute. But I do want to make sure this is worth your time, and knowing that you can take action is the best way to know it's been valuable. And finally, I do want to mention that Grantek does provide some services around data integrity, consulting, assessments, and remediation. And I'm going to go over those more towards the end of the webinar. I plan on providing a lot of valuable information and references in the webinar so that this content is going to be valuable to you, whether you choose to work with Grantek on this subject or not. But you will get a little peek of how we approach this topic with our customers at the end of the session. I will also say we have a couple of survey questions over in the polls section of the webinar, which is kind of on the right side of the window. This is just to get some basic information on where you're at in your data integrity journey and what you want to focus on. So I don't want to interrupt the flow of the webinar, so I'm not going to be pulling poll answers in the middle of it, but we're going to check the results of this at the end and see if they drive any interesting conversations in our Q&A. So if you have a time while we're going through some of this information, please jump on over there and feel free to answer some of the questions that are in there to help us out. I'm also going to take a quick minute to introduce myself. My name is Sam Russem. I am the Director of Smart Manufacturing at Grantek, and my job is to guide our customers, our company at Grantek, and the industry as a whole towards ways that we can successfully be implementing modern technology into our manufacturing businesses. I really like my job. It gives me a great opportunity to see a lot of different manufacturing environments and look to the future of manufacturing technology from a very practical perspective and do fun things like present this webinar to you all today. I'm based out of Philadelphia, but as many of you know, Grantek has offices across North America and India, so I'm available wherever I'm needed. I've personally been at Grantek for over 10 years now, starting on the automation programming side before shifting into more of a focus on data collection and reporting. I ran a regional manufacturing IT group for a while and then joined our PMO as a senior project manager focusing on IT projects before taking on my current director role. I'd also like to briefly introduce Bryon Hayes, who is Grantek's Director of Life Sciences, and he's going to be supporting me on the webinar as well. We co-developed a lot of the content together, and we'll probably get some of his direct input in the Q&A section at the end. So that's enough of introductions and preamble. Let's start talking more about data integrity itself. And where best to start then with a basic definition of data integrity to make sure that we're all on the same page. So FDA Guidance describes data integrity as maintaining the completeness, consistency, and accuracy of data throughout its life cycle. And when we say throughout its life cycle, we mean from creation to processing, turning raw data into useful information, to reviewing, reporting, and use, so how we use that information to make decisions, to retention and retrieval, how do we store that information for its entire retention period, and how do we access it for follow-ups, reviews, or audits, and finally to destruction, how we properly dispose of data once its retention period is over. And that whole process from creation through to destruction is commonly referred to as the data lifecycle. Data integrity is emphasized to support two very important and related points: product quality and consumer safety. Regarding product quality, you are using this data to demonstrate that you made the product the correct way within specifications every time. Clearly, having a high reliability and high quality product is important for your company's reputation and ability to do business, and it directly relates to consumer safety. Quality failures like unidentified ingredients and allergens, mispackaged products, and over or underdosed products can all lead to major risks for patients, consumers, and other end users. No one here wants to be putting low quality or dangerous products into the marketplace, and a commitment to data integrity and best practices can significantly lower that risk. So where does data integrity apply? Well, it's strictly regulated in life sciences industry, so pharmaceuticals, medical devices, things like that. And that has been a major focus of regulators over the past few years. However, the general principles of data integrity are important for all manufacturers to make good data-driven decisions, especially those with significant regulatory oversight from organizations like the FDA or EPA or Health Canada. Now, in life sciences, data integrity is a fairly common term, so it's easy to identify when that's what people are talking about. But if you're from another industry, like food and bev or CPG, those concepts may be encapsulated in other regulations or best practices. For example, the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, or if people are referring to conforming to good manufacturing practices or CGMPs. There are data integrity implications and expectations that are carried along in each of those policies. The degree to which your organization focuses on data integrity probably changes based on regulatory pressure, but again, as we start to use this data to make more informed decisions, it's very important for all industries. And finally, it's important to know that data integrity is not limited to computerized systems. This applies equally to paper-based, computer-based, or hybrid systems. Really anything that produces data can be considered in scope. But it's also clear that the rise of computers and having more data and more data-driven decisions than ever before is clearly emphasizing the importance of these types of regulations and rules. Which brings us to our next topic. Why now? Why is this a good time for us to be talking about data integrity? Well, first, it's a major focus area for regulators. Over 75% of warning letters issued by the FDA to the life sciences manufacturers in 2018 cited issues with data integrity, and the trends show this is a major point of emphasis in recent audits. Also, again, the concept here is more the data that leads to good data-driven decisions, and that means having a good data integrity system can have far-reaching implications to overall product quality. And as we continue to go down these paths of smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0 and IIoT, the importance of having good data is only going to grow. So having a solid plan for data integrity in place now can really pay dividends down the line. So that covers some of the background of data integrity as a concept and why it's important. But now let's talk a little bit more about what makes good data. And to understand good data, we start by understanding different types of data and how they're used together. So first we have our raw data, and this is our straight sensor readings. These are temperature readings or a speed of a mixer or chromatography data or quality test data. Again, direct readings from your manufacturing process. And then we have metadata that's associated to that. That's going to give that raw data more context and meaning. For example, what time was a reading taken, who in the quality lab ran this test, or what production order were we filling during the specific run. Now, the data and the metadata together are combined to form what's called a record. And then if that record is going to be used for a regulated purpose or to serve a regulated process, it becomes a regulated record. Data integrity principles can be applied to all data, but they are typically a necessity for regulated data. And when we talk about needing good data to make good decisions, one of the principles you hear all the time is Alcoa Plus. So Alcoa Plus is an acronym used to summarize the principles of GDP's good documentation practices, and it's commonly referenced by the WHO, PICS, and FDA when they're discussing data integrity. There's a lot of information on Alcoa Plus out there that you can find with a quick Google search. So for the purposes of this webinar, I'm just going to review briefly each of the topics that are mentioned in there, just so that we know how you, and as I do so, I want you to think about how your organization applies and proves compliance with each of these principles today. So we start with attributable. You need to know where the data is coming from and who or what made it. It needs to be legible. You need to clearly be able to see what that data reading is. It should be contemporaneous, recorded at the right time, not remembered and then written down later. It should be original. You need to have the first recording or a true copy of the data. Accurate, the data needs to properly represent the truth that it's meant to. And then we get to some of the pluses, right? So that includes complete, having all the data, including relevant metadata, and a clear record of any modifications. Consistent, good practices lead you to getting good data the same way every time. Enduring, maintained for the entire retention period, which can be set by a regulator or your company policy. And finally, available, that you can get it if and when you need it. It seems simple enough, and I think that we can all agree that data that conforms to each of these principles is data that we would trust and could use to make good decisions. But again, think about how this applies to your business. Do you have a good handle on each of these principles? And very importantly for regulators, how do you demonstrate and prove it? What's your official policy, and how do you make sure that that's enforced? Okay, and with that, we've covered most of the background that we need before we get into more best practices. At this point, you should understand that data integrity is about maintaining the completeness, consistency, and accuracy of data throughout the life cycle. You should know that data integrity is important for product quality and consumer safety. You know when data becomes regulated data and how that's particularly relevant for good data integrity policies. And we've discussed Alcoa Plus and what makes data good. So with that context in mind, we move on to some of our best practices. There's 5 data integrity best practices we're reviewing today. I'll give a quick preview of each and then we'll go into more details on the remaining slides. So that's going to include making data integrity a primary focus of your quality management system or QMS, using your QMS as a tool to promote data integrity and best practices for the entire organization, embedding data integrity into your company culture with sponsorship from senior leadership, leveraging applicable industry standards and maturity models, and finally, planning early and with scalability in mind. First, we're going to do a deeper dive into data integrity and your QMS, and this topic gets a little star because we're going to spend a good amount of time on this principle. Your quality management system, or QMS, should be a comprehensive document or set of documents that describes your organization's entire quality management plan. And data integrity should be one of the major focus areas of that system. Your QMS should address your data governance framework, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a bit, over the entire data lifecycle from creation through destruction, and address all the Alcoa Plus requirements that we mentioned earlier. And then it's also worth talking about one concept that you're going to hear a lot when discussing a QMS around taking a risk management approach. I really like actually how this is framed in some of the FDA and ISPE guidance, where they say the effort required to assess and manage risk should be commensurate to the level of risk. So essentially what they're getting at there is that you work to control the things that are most likely to go out of control and or that have the most significant implications if they were to go out of control. So if you were writing out data integrity risks in a matrix like the one you see on the right, you are most concerned with the ones in the upper right, the extreme risk and high risk items that would have a major severity if they were to occur, and they are more likely than others to occur. So when performing an assessment and remediation, it's important to identify not only the level of risk, but its source. You need to make sure that things that you're working to control actually affect the end results that you're looking for. And you need to consider those risks across all data governance areas, which we'll talk more about right now. Quality best practices frequently divide quality risks into three categories: people, process, and technology, which we control using behavioral, procedural, and technical controls, respectively. Behavioral controls focus on the human contributions to data. So common behavioral control discussion topics include how you establish and maintain data integrity as a part of your company culture, which we'll talk about more in one of our later best practices. It's also important to make sure you're considering both intentional and unintentional human error. Intentional human errors can be indicative of a bigger cultural issue and oftentimes can result from pressure, opportunity, and self-rationalization, whereas unintentional errors are usually caused by mistakes, improvisation when things go wrong, or simple slip-ups that might have a major implication. Now, it's worth noting that based on what we see in life sciences FDA warning letters, regulators don't really care if a human error is intentional or unintentional. They are treated as equal data integrity lapses, but you need to make sure that you're controlling for both. On the process side of things, we're more concerned with procedural controls that make it easy to do the right thing. Examples include having data entry stations physically close to where data is collected to support the Alcoa Plus principle of contemporaneous data entry, or you can use a procedure to control a human risk factor, like procedurally reducing opportunities for people to take shortcuts. Manual data recording is a common risk point that's addressed through proper procedural controls, and procedural controls are often also used to emphasize another important tenet of data integrity in life sciences, maintaining incomplete or erroneous data as a part of the permanent record. You need to have procedures in place that demonstrate how you identify when a data recording was incorrect and why and how it was corrected. But we're going to spend a little more time discussing technical controls. This is a smart manufacturing webinar after all. Technical controls address how we build data integrity into the systems and tools that generate, compute, and store our data. It's not limited to computerized systems, but that's definitely one of the focus areas, especially in the modern day. And technical controls are also where you find another important tenet of data integrity for life sciences, which is computer system validation. So we should note computer systems and their related equipment need to be validated for their intended use. And in that validation process, you should have some provisions for ensuring Alcoa Plus principles are met. So again, since we're talking about smart manufacturing and technology in the way that we address data integrity, let's go over some specific examples of technical controls that come up frequently. And we've picked these based on the ones that are most often cited as problematic in FDA warning letters. For each of these controls, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is, and then give a couple of example questions that Grantek typically asks as we do a data integrity assessment on that topic. So as we go through this material, I'm going to ask that you think about how you would answer some of these sample questions for your organization. And again, not just how you would answer it, but how you would prove it. Our first topic is user access control, how users access computerized control and data systems. Essentially, this is just how you log into your computers, your usernames and passwords, as well as the privileges that are assigned to you once you have logged in. Really, at the end of the day, for most users, we're talking about Microsoft Active Directory, as that is the most common computer user control system for industrial applications. This could also, though, include any types of biometrics or tokens that you could be using to log into computer systems and to ensure that the person who's logging in is the person who is actually using the system. Here are a couple of common assessment questions that we would ask related to user access control, which I'll read through here, but I won't go into too much detail just in the interest of time. So some common questions include, does everybody have a personal login? Do we use user groups with role-based security privilege with segregation of duties? Do the users who are responsible for creating data have direct access to the data itself? Can you access the system with somebody else's login? And what is the procedure for updating privileges, adding users, and removing users? Again, think about how you go about answering some of these questions for your organization. Do you know the answer to someone else, or would you really have to work to figure this stuff out? Next, we'll talk more about audit trails, another recurring point in FDA warning letters. Audit trails are the metadata records that facilitate the reconstruction of activities. Essentially, they're your list of who did what when. They are fairly common in a lot of our modern computer systems, but you need to make sure that the audit trail data that's being provided is matching your QMS and your quality standards. And it should be noted that when we do run into older systems that may not have audit trails by default, retrofitting those or bringing them into compliance can be more of a challenge. So common assessment questions there include, are audit trails automatically generated for operator actions that create, modify, or delete electronic records? Do users have access to modify audit trails? Is it possible to disable an audit trail? Are audit trail records complete and sufficient? And are electronic audit trails readily available for inspection? Last but not least, we talk a bit about electronic signatures. As our attendees from life sciences are certainly going to know, electronic signatures are the electronic equivalent of a legally binding individual handwritten signature. They're used to verify electronic records, and they need to be attributable to a qualified and responsible individual. There's a lot of rules about how electronic signatures are managed, found in the FDA's 21 CFR Part 11. As this is critical for life sciences, there are documented best practices that directly apply to electronic signatures and data integrity. So some of our common assessment questions are, is there a written policy in place that holds individuals accountable for the actions initiated under their signature? Are changes to signatures included in the audit trail? Is each electronic signature unique to one individual? And is an individual's identity verified prior to the issuance of a signature? So that covers a lot of our best practices on how to make data integrity a focus of your QMS. Data integrity is an important subset to your overall quality plan, and your quality plan is documented in your QMS, and therefore your data integrity strategy is mostly in that QMS too. And make sure you're being comprehensive, covering the behavioral, procedural, and technical controls in your data integrity strategy. So now that we have our data integrity policies enshrined and documented in our QMS, what are the best practices for how you actually use that QMS to drive results? So we're going to talk about how you can use your QMS to encourage best practices on new projects, to assess existing systems, and to help you think like a regulator. First, we cover new projects, where you have a unique opportunity to realize data integrity by design, a very popular concept when we talk about data integrity these days. Showing that major projects were designed with data integrity specifically in mind goes a long way to show how your organization values data integrity and that you design with data integrity on the forefront. A key component to data integrity by design is using your QMS early and often. This should be a tool that you publicize and communicate to your project teams, both internally and with external vendors. It's also really valuable if you have OEM equipment coming in. It should be reviewed and compared to your QMS to understand how much it complies with your systems out of the box, any potential cost to customize it to compliance, and if there's a situation where you're not going to be able to immediately remediate and bring it into conformance, how do you deal with that risk? You can save a lot of effort down the road by considering data integrity throughout the project process. But that doesn't help us with all the systems that we've had in place for years that contribute data to our overall pool. So how do we handle those too? This is where having internal audits and self-assessments can be really valuable, and they'll test how effective your QMS policies are. Conducting a self-assessment itself is a great indicator that you are culturally committed to data integrity and it lets you see how the rest of your organization responds to this inquiry. But most importantly, you'll identify some of the data integrity gaps you have today that you may want to proactively remediate, and frankly, that can go a very long way for regulators. Of course, it is best not to have any data integrity issues or risks, but if you're catching them yourselves and you have a strategy in place to reconcile it, that can really go a long way. And as you're designing for data integrity and reviewing these systems, it is always useful to think about how a regulator, somebody external to your organization and who is professionally checking for things like data integrity, is going to examine your systems. As you think like someone from the outside, you're going to start to notice what's needed to streamline the process. So how can you demonstrate your commitment to data integrity as clearly and easily as possible? Identify the things that you know you're going to need, like a GXP, an inventory of your GXP systems and your actual QMS documents ready to go. Most people running assessments will be trained in critical thinking skills too, so they'll be actively trying to poke holes in your strategy and looking for ways to get around the systems and policies in place. You can proactively address a lot of that with your internal audits and assessments yourself. Do your best to remove your biases from having worked in your company every day for a while, and really try to think about it as somebody from the outside looking in. And finally, think about how an effective cultural commitment to data integrity looks to someone from the outside. If you can demonstrate that you're serious about data integrity and want to put in a sincere effort to get better, then an audit transforms from a risk to your business to an opportunity to improve. Speaking of cultural commitments to data integrity, that is our next point. It is essential that this commitment comes from the top and your senior leadership team. FDA guidance actually specifically states that senior management is ultimately responsible for data integrity, and they specifically mention promoting the requirements of data integrity, providing the appropriate resources, resolving issues, defining priorities, and the ultimate one, ensuring data integrity is achieved. So while it is everyone's responsibility to contribute to and support data integrity, that direction needs to come from the top. I also want to talk about how the FDA guidance discusses open and closed cultures and their effects on data integrity. So open cultures are characterized by a hierarchy that can be challenged by subordinates, full reporting of failure as a business expectation, and employees that are empowered to identify and report issues in accordance to your QMS. On the other hand, closed cultures are usually characterized by having reporting failure or challenging hierarchy being culturally much more difficult. It typically requires a greater emphasis on oversight and secondary reviews, and it typically requires a confidential escalation process to senior management. So that leads us to our actual best practices around culture, which is, you really need to do a true assessment of where your company culture is today and manage it appropriately. It's hard to shift between an open or a closed culture, and committing to data integrity can't wait for a big culture shift. It's more important for you to truly acknowledge where you are today and manage that appropriately. You can have data integrity in open and closed cultures as long as it's properly managed. It's also important to make sure your senior leadership team is aware of their level of responsibility around data integrity. And if they aren't aware, there is plenty of documentation available to help back that up. Finally, it's important to realize that there isn't just one culture you need to deal with. Cultures can change regionally, between facilities, or even between departments. So again, you need to realistically assess where you're at and make sure that you're creating your data integrity strategy that's going to work for everybody. Our next best practice talks about how to leverage applicable industry standards and maturity models that can help in your data integrity journey. There's a lot of industry standards that are vertical independent and speak to best practices around data management. And a lot of these standards and best practices build off of each other too. So you'll find that if you're committing to, say, ISA 88 for batch process controls, you'll find that other documentation from ISO and the FDA regulations may allude to those standard models as a frame of reference. That's why the standards are there. The ISA and ISO are two organizations that I personally use most frequently for those types of standards. And for data integrity specifically, I would refer you to ISO 8000 on data quality and enterprise master data, ISA 95, and ISA 88. Another thing that might be useful for you and your team is one of the many data integrity maturity models that are out there. These are really valuable for understanding your current and desired future state on a more analog scale instead of simply yes/no questions. It also lets you establish value propositions for different maturity areas. So if you're at, say, a level 2 in a certain category, clearly getting to a level 5 is ideal, but might be a fraction of the price to get to a level 4, and based on the risk of the issue that you are looking at, that would be fine and would still hit your primary goals, right? Maturity models are also good for assessing a variety of different areas like cultural and organizational structure and aren't focused on just a technical aspect of a project. So if you're going to make improvements to your company's data integrity strategies, I recommend looking at some of the other relevant industry standards and maturity models to find the right set of tools to address your needs. Which takes us to our final best practice and the one most related to smart manufacturing, planning early and with scalability in mind. So smart manufacturing is a big space. The term is essentially a US-driven equivalent to the German Industry 4.0, but semantics aside, the most important thing to know is that smart manufacturing is all about a new era of data availability, use, and value across the manufacturing supply chain. So smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0 projects inherently lead to more data and more data-driven decisions because that's the point. And if that data is being used for a regulated purpose or to serve a regulated process, remember, that means it's regulated data, and that means that data integrity frequently becomes a requirement. So on the data collection side of smart manufacturing, we're getting a lot more tools to help us collect data from the shop floor. So IIoT devices, new network technologies like wireless and 5G, and open protocols like OPC UA and MQTT. All of these technologies are about making more data more available. And that increase in data inherently leads us to more data-driven decisions, and therefore more scrutiny is applied to data integrity principles. And beyond regulatory responsibility, it's in your best interest to invest in data integrity to make sure the data you're analyzing is correct and useful. Remember, data is referring to the raw information and needs context and processing to become useful information. That might populate a dashboard or a report or something that a user acts on. If the original data is faulty, that's going to lead to bad information and bad decisions. And a lot of the rising technologies in manufacturing and smart manufacturing, like advanced analytics, machine learning, big data, and cloud computing, all of those rely on having good data, and data integrity is a great way to lead you to that. So it's good for us to all understand that someone in the FDA didn't just wake up one morning and decide to start bothering people about data integrity. No, this sudden increase in data and data-driven decisions is why this has become such a regulatory focus. And data integrity issues have the potential to go out of control as we add more and more data points into our systems. So it's best to establish your QMS as soon as possible before you fall too far behind and it gets too costly to remediate. Finally, you need to make sure you're finding the right balance and point of view for how far into the future your QMS looks. It's an evolving document, and you should expect that it's going to change with technology and new regulatory emphases and new management structures, but you want to try to accommodate for the future as much as reasonably possible within that as well. So to recap our best practices for data integrity, we talked about making data integrity a primary focus of your QMS, then using that QMS as a tool to promote data integrity and best practices throughout the organization. We talked about embedding data integrity into your company culture with sponsorship from senior leadership. We talked about the leveraging applicable industry standards and maturity models, and finally, about the importance of planning early and with scalability in mind. So now that we've set up the context and discussed some of the best practices, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on how Grantek turns these ideas into action. There are 4 primary categories of assistance that Grantek normally provides to support our customers in their data integrity initiatives. The first one is broad, more general consulting. So if you were doing something like, say, writing a QMS from scratch for a new facility, or if you had another big documentation practice or assessment ahead of you, we just do have general consultants that can come in, and have seen this at a lot of different manufacturers and can help you along that journey. I want to spend a little more time, though, on the more described and detailed process around how we do assessments, remediation planning, and remediation projects. So here's a visual representation of the data integrity roadmap we tend to follow when our customers need help with data integrity. It starts with a scoping and scaling phase where we work to understand where you are and where you need help with your data integrity assessments. We've done this a lot of different ways where maybe we focus on one problem area or we have a multi-site plan. This is meant to be a flexible process that can accommodate a lot of different situations. The next 3 phases are the real assessments, broken into an investigate, prepare, and assess phase. We'll get more into that on some of the next slides, but the output of that activity is our assessment report, gap analysis, and risk reduction plan. And I mentioned that because those become key documents for the remediation planning phase. This is where we work cooperatively with your team, look at the identified risks, and start to prioritize them and turn those risks into potential remediation projects. Once that's done, Grantek has an experienced team of engineers, project managers, and consultants who can help you put those remediation projects into action. And we may go through this process more than once to cover different areas of interest or to iterate over time, but that's the general flow of scoping, assessing, planning, and remediating. As we run our assessments, we're using the same context we encourage you to use for your QMS and that the regulators reference. So we're using the data governance framework, we're looking at the entire data lifecycle, and we're checking it for those Alcoa Plus requirements. Where we put more of our spin on it is how we try to identify the important data flows within a system, between systems, and when users interact with the systems. For example, each of these blocks may generate, transform, or use data from manufacturing processes. As data moves from block to block, that's one risk point. These blocks are typically divided into subsystems or lines, and anytime there's a transfer from one system to another, that's another risk point. And finally, we need to make sure we're taking a close look at the times that we have human-machine interfaces as well. So mapping out your process like this and understanding where these interactions and transfers happen is crucial to identifying high-risk areas. As we mentioned earlier, our assessment process includes an investigation phase, preparation phase, and assessment phase. Investigations can be a combination of on-site work to see things in action and collect documents, and off-site work for analysis. Our investigations start with a system inventory where we list out the systems we need to examine. We compare that to our original assessment scope that we laid out to make sure that we're in the right space. And we make sure that we're considering everything from the creation through the destruction of data. Then we get into the prioritization phase, where we take a closer look at system criticality, documented data integrity concerns, and the results of any audits you may have. And then we collect some of the pertinent information we know we'll need, like architecture drawings and software lists. As we go deeper into preparation, we start doing a deeper dive into some of the documentation. So design documents like your URSs and FRSs, qualification protocols, and SOPs. We also start getting into more of the code here, your PLCs, HMIs, scripts, and software backups. All those are game. And this is also where we have more interviews with the subject matter experts from IT, and operations, supervisors, common OEMs, and vendors. Once we've reviewed all that information, we get into our assessment phase. First, we evaluate the current state, identifying compliance gaps and referencing the relevant regulations, and going through the checklist questions like the ones I previewed earlier when we discussed technical controls. With a known endpoint of data integrity compliance and an understanding of the current state, we can develop a gap analysis, identify unacceptable risks, and any inadequate technical controls. Then we get to our recommendations, where we develop and document ways to reduce identified risks, assign control measures, and estimate future state risk if the reduction plan is followed. It's quite a process, but it's what's necessary if we are going to share responsibility with you to improve your data integrity. And if that strikes a chord with you, please do not hesitate to reach out to Grantek for more information. Speaking of, that will take us towards the end of our session today. As I close out, there's going to be a short Q&A session at the end, so you are encouraged to open up the chat on the right side, and if you do have any questions, you are encouraged to put them there. And if there's one thing I hope that you take away from today's session, I hope it's an understanding that if you're concerned about your organization's data integrity strategy, then it's the responsibility of you, your senior management, and your entire organization to get better. Safety, quality, and reputation are all on the line. Of course, it would be great if you want to use Grantek to help support you, and if so, I would encourage you to email us at info@grantek.com, or each of you can reach out to any personal Grantek contacts you may have if you want to learn more. But you also may decide to do this on your own as well, and I earnestly wish you the best of luck in doing so, and I would refer you to resources from the ISPE and the FDA websites listed here as great resources to help you along that journey. So with that, we are going to get to some questions and answers. And as people are typing out questions, what I might do is jump into some of the polls and talk about some of the responses that we had in here. So our first poll question was around how you would describe your organization's overall data integrity maturity on a scale from 1 to 5. And the answer spanned everything, actually. We got a couple of points in every single one of those, so we had a lot of different perspectives coming into the webinar today. When I was asking how familiar people are with data governance, the data lifecycle, and Alcoa Plus, most people rank themselves at around a 3. And as we talked about kind of what people were most interested in today, it sounds like most of it was around data integrity in general and some best practices for data integrity, and less so on how smart manufacturing affects data integrity, which, lucky me, that's actually kind of how the things worked out in the plan. So good for us. Okay, and I'm starting to get a couple questions fed to me too. Our first question is a smart manufacturing question. So people are asking, how does cloud computing play into data integrity? If we send our data to a cloud-based service for analysis, where do our data integrity responsibilities begin and end? Also, I will answer this first, but Bryon, if you wanted to come off of mute and add anything once I'm done, now is your time to get your webinar points. So my first thought at cloud computing is the overall responsibilities of data integrity do not change. You are still responsible, especially if it is a regulated record, to control data in the same way and make sure it is right, whether that is entirely on-premise or in the cloud. So how do you do that? That actually becomes a major discussion point as you are working with your cloud provider to make sure that you are emphasizing that as something that you're focused on and getting the right information that you need out of them to respond appropriately, right? So I have seen that take the form of certain service level agreements that you have with each of these organizations, maybe times that you do assessments with them to make sure things are right, and just a thorough review of their policy and incorporating some of that into your own QMS. Bryon, do you have anything that you want to add to that around cloud computing and data integrity?
Yeah, mainly around the fact that, you're losing somewhat of a sense of control over your own data. You're kind of offloading a little bit of the data control of the data into your cloud service provider, but you are still responsible for it. So really, where you need to, as an end user, where you need to focus, put a lot of focus on would be your contract with your cloud service provider, making sure you have a service level agreement or SLA in place, making sure that references the requirements of applying or GXP principles, data integrity, making sure that your cloud service provider is capable of supporting that.
Cool, great. And Bryon, stay off mute for a little bit because I want you to take a first pass at the next question we have. Is there a difference in approach to data integrity within a lab versus in a manufacturing environment?
That's a really good question. Within the lab is it's not an area that I've specifically focused a lot of my time, but I've done a lot of reading around a lot of critical data integrity findings from the regulatory agencies around the lab itself, mainly around the altering of records or the interface of between the user of a specific piece of lab equipment and the piece of equipment itself. They have a lot of manual equipment, a lot of instrumentation, and their actions are also of high criticality. Oftentimes they're doing like in-process controls over a specific batch of product, and their results are dictating whether actual manufacturing of a batch can either proceed or not proceed. So that's where a lot of critical GXP decisions are being made. So I would say a larger focus of data integrity should be placed on the lab itself, due to the fact that you have a lot more interactions between personnel and equipment and personnel and instrumentation that may or may not be designed with data integrity in mind. You may have, may be running, an assay on some piece of equipment that is, storing data to a local hard drive. You have no way of, ensuring that there's adequate control, or you have a limited way through SOPs. So proper SOP design and proper training of your personnel around data integrity is key there as well. So
Sure.
I hope that answered your question. Ultimately, with respect to data integrity, the principles are the same. It's just, I think the focus, there needs to be a bit more of focus, because you're relying more on personnel in that case.
And actually, Bryon, I will jump off of that, because our next question is actually kind of related, in that somebody was asking where we draw the line with respect to the term manufacturing, and if we're talking about, say, packaging and not manufacturing, does the same level of rigor apply? And the answer, and actually for that, I would refer you back to that risk-based approach of how we look at these, right? Where you need to look at the risk of something bad happening and the implications of something, of if that risk were to actually take place, right? So packaging can actually have major implications on data integrity. Packaging the wrong product into a package and shipping that out to the door is one of the worst things that you can do as far as putting bad quality product on the market. So I do not, and Bryon, correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think that there is a specific difference between packaging or manufacturing when looking at data integrity. It's just, again, similar to what we look at in the lab. The principles are the same. You might just have different points of emphasis or parts of the data governance model that you need to emphasize differently, based on the risks that you have in each of those different areas.
Yeah, and as the requirements for packaging serialization and aggregation come online, this is going to be an increasing focus, for the global supply chain. Beginning last year, and as things get more and more rigorous into the next few years, they're going to be seeing a lot more eyes on this. So. So yeah, I think it's just as important.
Great, thank you. Let me see, other questions I might have. We do have one question in from somebody who says that they work for more of a food and beverage plant, and they were wondering, so they're saying some of this stuff is a little bit newer to them, and it seems like a daunting task. So how important is all of this if you do not have regulators on your back pushing you towards it? And I think the answer there is it's still pretty important, especially if you are in food and beverage. I think it's just a matter of time before FSMA and the FDA do focus more on data integrity, especially when it comes to important things like, again, like packaging and traceability data and allergens and things like that. But no matter what, at the end of the day, we're going back to that general principle of you need to have that data be solid if you are making decisions based on that data, right? So even if it is something that has nothing to do with the actual products that go out the door, maybe it's just prioritizing the work that your maintenance team is doing based on breakdown data or things like that, you still want to have that as correct as possible. So yeah, maybe the level of rigor might change, but that idea of making sure that the data that you're going to use is actually usable for the purpose that you want it to is certainly very important.
With the legalization around cannabis derived products in Canada, edible products, and as such, we're starting to see a lot of food and beverage manufacturers actually looking to incorporate some of that into their own products that they're bringing to market, and that's actually starting to blur the lines between what constitutes a food and beverage product and what constitutes a regulated product. Yeah, so that's something to look that I'm looking at right now myself is seeing how these food and beverage companies are are looking to manufacture and change how they manufacture moving forward based on that.
Yeah, Ryan. That's why, Brian. That's why here in the U.S. it's the Food and Drug Administration. So I got one more question in here I want to hit on before we shut this down for the day. It was, what happens if we have an audit and we do get a warning letter on data integrity? Very good question. The answer is that the letter is a warning. It is not something that is going through and shutting you down. There are procedures. There is the possibility that you have an audit or an assessment and you do need to get shut down. That is more rare, and hopefully you have lots of controls in place to manage that type of risk. But if it is something with a warning letter, usually those come with a specific time frame that they want you to remediate it on, and they'll go through and check that. So if you do get that warning letter, you just got to read it thoroughly, make sure that you really understand the issues, and that you put in a plan to remediate those issues and get those fixed as soon as possible. But you're right, it's not immediately shutting you down. It should just become one of your top priorities really as soon as it comes in. Okay, and with that, I think that we are going to wrap up the webinar today. So I will say a quick thank you to everybody for taking the time out of your busy days to come in here and join us. I really appreciate it. Again, if you do have any questions about data integrity and the way that Grantek approaches this or any of the other things that we might be able to help you out with in your manufacturing operations, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. Thanks again for taking the time today, and everybody have a great rest of your day.